Good evening and most welcome to 953 of the series. It is advancing hastily here, no doubt. I would today talk about 953. Let's go back to Eagleman, now in page 125 of Fractal Time. David Eagleman has looked into schizophrenia cases, and that is particularly pertinent since this is also the subject for Ian McGilchrist. And here's a quote from an article written by him. We have recently discovered that a deficit in temporal order judgment may underlie some of the hallmark symptoms of schizophrenia, such as misattribution of credit. My hand moved, but I did not move it. And auditory hallucinations, which may be an order reversal of the generation and hearing of normal internal monologue. And as I mentioned earlier, internal monologue is the pink noise, but it could also be your thinking. It doesn't really make any discrepancy here. It is rather hard to tell which is which, and once more it has to do with the causus finalis and causis existentialis. Those things regulate this rather than an original cause or an original thing. This is quite a different take on all aspects of human thinking, and nothing seems to be completely excluded. It's a sort of co-joint effort that we do when we try to understand what is happening around us, and simultaneity and sequencing are incredibly important in this. And when they fail, either through a rather light mishap, as for instance being too loop-sided, having more of a loop than going into the outer reality, or it is the case that you are not really able to direct your thinking outwards, which is a common trait in all psychological infirmities. They all have problem projecting outwards. I think we earlier said they're not too social. Well, I think that is not the main cause. Of course, that's part of the symptoms, but they're definitely not projecting outwards. And if you see the bodily status, in most cases they are sedentary. They don't move about specifically. They are mostly lying down, sitting down, slouching. Their body posture, especially when it comes to schizophrenics, is appalling. They can put their body into torturous positions without feeling anything. And since I mentioned perception is an active thinking process, not so much a physical, these people lack perception of their own bodily functioning. And we know in the body all satisfaction lies. So if you lose the contact, more or less as René Descartes did, if you lose the contact with the body, you will also immediately lose satisfaction. You can no longer have what can you say? You can no longer have full perceptual interaction with your own endogenous embodiment, and that is unsatisfactory. Satisfaction doesn't come from the brain. It's a harmonious body-mind wave, and it cannot be copied by drugs. It was long thought that you could give people some drug and they'll be happy. No, the drugs do what they do. I heard this term the other day, camouflage drugs. What they do is they actually have an effect on the facial traits of the person, which can be important, but it's not the whole McCoy. What they do is they start to smile more often. Their bodies continue to be stiff, uneven, discoordinated, and don't give out any happiness. But to the outside perspective, it looks like they are more happy. It could actually be that the healing process, thanks to the medication, stops. So instead of changing their direction, they can get stuck in the place where they already are. And I would say that is possibly the saddest of all those possibilities. So what should have been some sort of healing of one situation, one social situation, one career, one's bodily position, becomes, because of these helping pills, a staying in the position you're already in. It helps to make static what should have been more soft, lucid, and opened up. Let me continue. Similar observations have been made by Dieter de Graaf, who claims that schizophrenia is a biopsychosocial order in its own right, as all nestings of events follows a close logic. It is only when a schizophrenic expectations do not match those of other observer participants that contradictions arise, which may lead to conflicts. Lauren Notale and Pierre Timas' research also tackles these problems in terms of congruence between inside and outside simultaneity. When we look at certain forms of schizophrenia, we are really dealing with timing, in parentheses, or nesting disease. Unsuccessful contextualizations leads to disorientation. We will deal with this topic in more detail in chapter 9, when we look at temporal misfits. If the brain waits for the slowest signal to arrive, as Engelman suggests, all awareness is postdictive. The delay is extremely useful as it allows for correctives, so that incoming stimuli can be adjusted in order to meet our expectations and generate a non-contradictory image of the world. We generate simultaneity within that tenth of a second window when we perceive the world by interacting with it. Perception is action. Whatever we then rate as simultaneous or successive determines the causal order of events of our realities, and thus the internal logic of our worlds. And I think this is finally leading up to a temporal order that is absolutely the same from a subjective and an objective standpoint. Without coming to this very, very important information, I would not have been able to make this jump into a more possibility of leading the two things to be the very same. A long time I've suspected that to be the case, but now I get an everyday colloquial way of explaining why these two things are exactly the same thing and how they need to be the same thing in some aspect, but also needs to be absolutely different when it comes to what sort of approach you take, whether it's exogenous or if it's endogenous. Your brain, after all, is encased in darkness and silence in the vault of your skull. It is only contact with the outside is via electrical signals exciting and entering along the superhighways of nerve bundles. Because different types of sensory information, hearing, seeing, touch and so on, are processed at different speeds by different neural networks. Your brain faces an enormous challenge. What is the best story that can be constructed about the outside world? End of quote. The brain is continuously integrating stimuli in such a way that no contradiction arises. Depending on the way we are conditioned by experience, individual A will create very different realities to individual B. These realities will be logically coherent, though they may turn out to be mutually incompatible. The integrative process which is at work here involves the nesting of stimuli, in the wake of which a temporal perspective is generated. The creation of simultaneity through such nesting increases delta t depth and decreases delta t length. The opposite is true for purely internally generated simultaneity, which manifests itself as entrainment in the brain. The synchronization of gamma waves, which have been associated with transcendental meditative states, are an example of such entrainment. During synchronization, stimuli are denested, which means that delta t depth decreases and delta t length approaches infinity. The same is true for entrainment between inside and outside, when the body locks into external rhythms. When internal and external structures resemble each other, there seems to be a pleasing congruence, which is often explained by the observation that humans are biophilic. That is to say, they like other living creatures and natural shapes. There appear to be a further strange attraction for humans in the shape of fractals, an appeal which we may call fractophilia, the observation that humans find fractal structures appealing. Let us have a look at two very different pathways, both which lead to fractophilia. The first pathway relates to neural synchrony as the basis of binding. As discussed earlier in this chapter, an experiment conducted by Erimaki et al. Shows that fractals are more efficient in evoking neural synchrony and binding than other stimuli such as kinesia figures, which are commonly used to study perceptual binding. The EEG responses to a complex fractal stimuli such as the Mandelbrot set showed an increased synchronization of EEG activities over the parieto-occipital areas, compared to the degree of synchronization a kinesia figure would evoke. I have to show you the Canisa figure. It's coming up here. I hope that could be seen. Let's show it once more. Better safe than sorry. There you got it. To compare the various degrees of synchrony, synchronization likelihood SL are a measure of both linear and non-linear interdependency between EEG channels. We employed Arimaki et al. Observed an increase in SL not only for gamma 1 and gamma 2 bands, but also for broadband. Hello there. Okay. But also for broadband SL, which means the interdependencies were not tied to specific frequencies. Earlier in this chapter we pointed out the correlations between consciousness and synchrony, as well as the meditating monk's feeling of total immersion and peacefulness. Although the increased synchrony measured during both the perception of appealing fractals and the peaceful state of meditation is a mere correlation, it is an interesting observation. Arimaki et al. Suggest that the increased synchronization they observed when individuals were exposed to fractal images may provide a neuropsychological basis for the frequent hypothesis that aesthetic preference is given to fractal images as opposed to non-fractal ones like the Canisa figures. Arimaki et al.'s results support the idea that if the observer fractal temporal perspective matches that of multisensory, multi-layered incoming stimuli, the internal degree of complexity roughly equals the external one. This results in a positive aesthetic perception if both the internal and the external structures display a similar degree of nesting. They may be congruent to a certain degree and synthesize a version of the world that is less complex. However, synchronization of nestings on the inside and the outside produces a kind of synchrony different from that which we have discussed in this chapter so far. Which brings us to the second pathway to synchronicity, one that is concerned with the matching internal and external patterns. Yannick Joye describes the advantages of implementing fractal geometry in architectural design, ranging from emotional to health effects such as stress reduction. As we mentioned earlier, the human body displays many fractal structures, from the scaling branches of our bronchial tubes to the fractal rhythms of our breathing, and so does our environment. We appear to show a presence for low to immediate fractal dimensions around 1.3, which matches the dimensions of natural objects such as clouds and coastlines. Our mind seems to be attuned to processing patterns with fractal dimensions of this scale, which roughly matches the level of complexity of the Koch curve, a mathematically generated fractal with a fractal dimension of 1.26. This dimension is consistent with studies of a relationship between complexity and aesthetic preference. The mind appears to look for an optimal arousal level between highly complex and simplistic patterns. Do not forget these Scrabbles by Polks. They are similar in that they were fractal, but they became increasingly more fractal, more complicated, more interactive as he progressed his painting works. And in the end, they reached 1.6, 1.7, something like that, which is a perfect description of aesthetics. And as I mentioned some other time, aesthetics and truth are very close knitted together. They are both at the same time in that vicinity of dimension 1.6, 1.7, but they also have a very interesting depth, and that depth is mostly intricate and very iterative. It turns up again and again and again and again. It never ends. This continuous process of nesting the endogenous with the exogenous is what makes for a very effective complexity. And as you can see here, speaking about meditation, finding a way to show the lack of knowledge in this area, as many people think to meditate is just to sit down and start doing something. Put your legs crosswise and start. Now it's quite clear that there are so many factors, and this is of course much more complicated than ever learning to weave or making shoes. Doesn't come anything close to the complexities of doing meditation. But for a Westerner it seems awfully simple. And the idea is also there is also always successful. You can't fail because we can't read the internal, therefore we can't guide us in the meditation. Neither can we afterwards read off if we had any results. So it's like severely autistic people doing meditation. The only thing they can notice is they have been sitting down and nothing else. And I think that sort of terminates the whole thing. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon, and I say goodbye for now. Bye bye.